Hi everyone, welcome to our next lecture. This week we're going to be covering the Psalms. Now the Psalms have sometimes been called, oftentimes in fact, been called the hymn book of the Second Temple by scholars. But really this doesn't quite encompass everything that the Psalms do and have done for the communities of faith. Really it would not be unfair to call the Psalter the hymn book of both the church and the synagogue. Christians and Jews have returned to the Psalms time and time again to find therein expressions of faith, to find prayers for communal and individual worship, and to find the words of comfort in times of distress and words of joy in times of celebration. The Psalms themselves exhibit a really enormous amount of variety. This includes variety in terms of length of various Psalms, in terms of the historical and mythological presentations of the world, in terms of the theological outlook of various Psalms, and in terms of the historical settings which gave rise to particular songs. And finally, there's also a lot of variety in terms of the particular poetic devices that are used to convey the messages within the Psalms. So I want to kind of begin this lecture by stepping back and looking a little bit at how the Psalms have been used by communities of faith. Like any good prayer book, the primary function, or one of the primary functions of the Psalms, is that they give us, first and foremost, a communal language of worship. So whether the Psalm itself speaks in the singular or the plural, whether it's using I or we language, these Psalms give common words and themes that are used in communal prayer. So for example, anyone who's ever heard the 23rd Psalm recited at a funeral has witnessed exactly this phenomenon. Though that psalm claims the language of I, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that singular voice there, it's communal in its recitation, or when it's recited communally, it gives voice to a collective faith and to the prayers of all the people that are gathered there and that are saying it at that time. As well as those who have said it before, right? It joins us together across time and space in a way. Secondly, it gives the community of faith words for times when words are difficult to find. One of the things to note that we'll notice today about the Psalms is that the lament Psalms, and in particular the individual lament Psalms, are the most frequent type of psalm. And it's surely no coincidence that these lament psalms correspond to life situations that are the most difficult. Those situations when finding words is a particular challenge. So we might note, for example, Jesus on the cross. And in that moment, Jesus quotes Psalm 22, which also happens to be the text that we will examine in detail this week. But what's going on here is that in these trying times, in these times when language can sometimes fail us, the Psalms can provide us words to use for our own struggle. A third thing that the Psalms do and have done is that they provide a musical setting for much of the church's history. So in the medieval church, for example, the chanting of Psalms formed a central part of the daily liturgy for monastic communities. Following the Reformation within Protestant circles, and in particular in Calvinist circles, many churches had the habit of only singing Psalms. That is, there wasn't quite a hymnody tradition so much as a Psalter tradition. And this is true of, this is part of the history of a number of churches, even in this presbytery, that were formed as psalm-only churches at some point in their history. Even following the rise of hymn singing in certain traditions, and as it entered into our own tradition, the Psalms have remained an important and really the primary source of inspiration for the hymns. And this is true if you pick up our current blue hymnal and the new Glory to God hymnal too. You'll see just how much influence and how big an impact the Psalms have had in our hymnody tradition. Given the size and the scope of the Psalter, though, all 150 of them, how can we really even begin to describe its contents as we kind of move into looking at the Psalms themselves? This is a question that we're going to have to deal with, And so over the next few minutes, we're going to attempt to get at this question by looking somewhat at how scholars have approached the Psalms, particularly in the last 100 years or so, and in particular the way that they've done this by categorization. So when we talk about the types of Psalms, the various groupings of Psalms that we have to pause here and we have to mention a scholar by the name of Hermann Gunkel. He is without a doubt the most important scholar in the last 100 years when it comes to the studies of the Psalms. Gunkel noted, as had many before him, but he noted that there were many Psalms that were similar in their expression and in their seeming function. And so what Gunkel did is he took this similar grouping that had been noted before, and he proposed that these Psalms belong to a particular Gattung, is the German word that he used, that we could translate as genre or form. And what Gunkel was saying here is that they not only share characteristics, but they actually share a kind of prototype. And that if we can kind of extrapolate from particular Psalms what that prototype is, and then compare how Psalms work to that prototype and to each other. So that what he's saying is that particular types have particular structures, and that the structures themselves carry meaning. That means it's not just the words of the psalm, but the structure that's used to carry those words. So if we take what Gunkel said, and we're going to extend that beyond here for a second, we can also claim that meaning is constructed in a psalm, both through content, that is what the words actually say, and through structure, how the words are arranged. So let's take an example here, and we can use that to showcase what we're talking about. In an individual lament psalm, there's a typical structural flow that goes complaint, petition, reason that God should intervene, and then finally a resolution to the psalm. The psalm, whatever the individual lament psalm that is, whatever the particularities of its circumstance and its situation, the particular words that are being used to describe what's going on with the psalmist, has this kind of expectation then that it's going to move from complaint to finally a praise section at the end that resolves the lament. But when this structure is altered, it is particularly jarring, and we can see this in Psalm 88. It begins with a normal summons, then it moves on to a complaint, although it's a really, really long complaint in this psalm. But at the end of the complaint, the psalm ends. The psalm itself ends there. There's no entreaty to God to take a particular action that would somehow rectify the psalmist's suffering, and there's certainly no assurance that God has heard or that God will act. Instead, the psalmist is simply left in the middle of a complaint with a certain unfinished and unsettled quality. Anybody who is familiar with a lament psalm would expect here a resolution, an expectation that is born of this normal structuring of this type of psalm. But in Psalm 88, Psalm 88, working with and really against these expectations, creates this very, very powerfully unsettling mood. And following Gunkel's lead, so Gunkel, who establishes and really describes these structures in a particularly helpful way, following Gunkel's lead, Brueggemann and Lennefeld, in the book that we've been using for this class, distill psalms into four basic categories: hymns, communal laments, individual laments, and psalms of thanksgiving. Now, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, and we should note that there are other types, generally less common types, but there are other types like sapiential or wisdom psalms, for example, Psalm 1, or royal psalms like Psalm 2. And there are also a number of songs that mix and match forms. Psalm 90, for example, opens as a communal lament, but ends as a wisdom psalm. So we see lots of mixing of forms as well. So sometimes these categories are not quite so neat as we would perhaps prefer. And again, Brueggemann and Lennefeld are really just trying to distill some of the larger themes here and bring them into a helpful reading scheme, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. If you're interested in a lot of these form studies, picking up the Gunkel's book is really the place to go to kind of see how a lot of this gets started and how some of it works. Even after almost 100 years, it remains an enormously important book in biblical studies, and in particular in studies of the Psalms. Now, so having done that, let's look at a few of these types of psalms and kind of explore how they work and how their structures unfold. So we're going to begin with the Psalms of Lamentation, and here I'm going to kind of lump together communal and individual psalms, even though there are some particularities about how each of those styles work. So the Lamentation psalm, both communal and individual, is, as we said earlier, the most common type of psalm in the Psalter. And there's a particular concentration of these in the first three kind of groupings of the Psalter. More on that in a moment. The fact that the lament psalm is the most common is oftentimes surprising to Christians who are more used to the hymns and the psalms of thanksgiving, but it's a fact that should not be ignored. Because what it demonstrates really is that the Psalms and the psalmist and the Psalms as a whole are really under no illusion about the harsh realities of the world. And that one of the primary points of Psalms, of prayer really, is to summon God into action where God's absence has been felt in the world. The two assumptions of these Psalms are really important to point out. One, the distress that the speaker has encountered is generally due to God's absence. In God's absence, that or perceived absence or real absence, and because in that absence, the psalmist's enemies, who are generally very vaguely described but are important characters in these psalms, in God's absence, these enemies have been allowed and have been able to come and threaten the psalmist in some way, which leads to our second point, which is that God's honor in the view of the psalmist, God who has been the protector and benefactor of the psalmist, that honor is at stake in the lament. That is, the psalmist is often not shy about describing the ways that God's own reputation could be in jeopardy if the speaker's persecution is allowed to continue. Our next type of psalm that we're going to describe this morning is the hymn of praise. So these psalms are the second most common type after the laments, but really they have the simplest structure. They're marked by a summons to praise, a main body that describes the reason why God should be praised, and then they conclude with another summons to praise. So Psalm 147 is a good example of this. Although it has a number of summons to praise kind of interspersed throughout the psalm, we can see that beginning summons and then long body that describes the wondrous things that God has done, and then that kind of concluding statement that once again leaves us on a note of a call to praise. Our third type that we're going to talk about today are the Thanksgiving Psalms. So these Psalms are similar in many ways to the hymns of praise in that they have a very kind of positive outlook. But one of the primary differences between the Thanksgiving Psalms and the hymns of praise is that the Thanksgiving Psalms generally look back to a particular action that God has done, oftentimes a help in a moment of distress. So Psalm 30 is a good example of this. That psalm opens with the statement of praise and thanksgiving, but then goes on to recall the situation when God's urgent action was needed and when God came through. The psalmist then acknowledges that God arose to action, and then concludes finally with another statement of praise. And this is a fairly typical way that a psalm of thanksgiving will unfold. So beyond these kind of three large categories of psalms, and remember, as we said, there are certainly other types of psalms, but there are a few important themes that I want to point out to make sure that we don't miss. The first of these is the prominence of the king and of Jerusalem or Zion in the Psalter. So many psalms have this important role that the king plays, and so we need to make note of that. And in particular, there's a scholar by the name, of Sigmund Mowinckel, really made a big deal out of this. Now, Mowinckel was Gunkel's student originally, but he was also oftentimes a critic of his. And what his great contribution to the field was that he located psalm studies within the ancient Jerusalem cult. And when I use that term cult here, I'm not referring to the way it gets thrown around in popular parlance, meaning like a reclusive sectarian group. Well, I mean, when we talk about the cult, we're talking about the temple and its workings, right? The people that are at work in the temple. And so what Mowinckel said was that the Psalms find their original place within the workings of the temple. Now, while sometimes this got carried to some unsustainable extremes, there really can be no doubt about the central role of Jerusalem in general, and oftentimes the king in particular, in many of the Psalms. The central theme that was so important for Mowinckel, and what he did was he used this to reconstruct really valuable, although sometimes speculative, information about the development of the history of Israelite religion, was what the king did as a central person in Israelite religion. So in particular, he emphasized the role that the Psalms would have played in liturgical rites that legitimized the Jerusalem-based Judean religion. Psalms like Psalm 2 go so far as to describe the king as a son of God, right? And we can see there and in other Psalms the special relationship between God and king. Other Psalms like Psalm 18, Psalm 21, Psalm 45, Psalm 72, and many, many others show this particular relationship. Other Psalms, like Psalm 132, depict Zion as God's favored place on earth and really God's permanent resting place. And we can see this theme as well throughout the Psalter. Another theme that's very, very important, and one that is oftentimes startling to Christian readers, is the role of creation within the psalm. Now, generally, when Christians think about creation, they think about, not surprisingly, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right? These are the prime and more or less normative accounts of creation in the Bible, but they're not the only accounts. And the Psalter is replete with themes of sometimes the continuing struggle between God and the forces of chaos that have their locus in creation stories. John Levinson has been a very important scholar who has highlighted these, and in particular his book, Creation and the Persistence of Evil, really argues rather persuasively for the persistence of these themes despite later editing of the Psalter that doesn't take these themes out, but gives a position of prominence to the more ordered creation centered around the concept of Torah. And really, this isn't just the editing of the Psalter, but the editing of the Bible in general. But this idea of a struggle between God and the forces of chaos, something that's called the Chaos Kampf motif, is still evident really in a number of places in the Bible, particularly the Psalter. Psalm 74 is one of the places where we can see this very, very clearly, where God at the dawn of time struggles with, but ultimately defeats, the powers of chaos symbolized in the water and the primordial sea monsters. Yet the thrust of this psalm is a lament, we should remember, and as such, it is a summons to God, that saying that God needs to act as God did in the distant past. So, as God drove back the waters of chaos at the beginning of time, so the psalmist is asking God now to once again push back the forces of chaos that are enclosing in on the psalmist's life. Now, we should note that this Chaos Kampf motif is really not at all the dominant motif. Yet, it remains a strong undercurrent in a number of places in the Bible. So it's in the Psalter, but we also see it in the latter chapters of Isaiah, and in a somewhat modified version in the God speeches in the book of Job as well. Indeed, really, its very presence is even more notable, given the way that it stands in somewhat of an opposition to the very ordered, structured creation that we find in Genesis 1. Now, much recent scholarship on the Psalms has really focused on trying to look at the Psalter and to see if there's meaning to be found in the Psalter as a collection. This line of research claims that it's really not enough to speak of individual psalms on their own, though they do exist on one level as atomized units and certainly can exist. This line of scholarship says that there also is some clear indication that within the Psalter there is some editorial intentionality, some shaping of the Psalter as a whole that is meaningful. So on a very surface level, we can see this in the superscriptions of the Psalter, psalms that are ascribed to David or Asaph or Korah, or psalms that are called the Psalms of the Sense that we see in the latter part of the Psalter. Now, while these superscriptions are very likely later additions, something that comes on long after the psalm itself was composed and is put in by later editors, we see their being put together as a collection as significant, even if it's not easy all the time to figure out why necessarily they are being grouped together. Beyond the superscription attributions, the Psalter is also divided into 5 sections. The first runs from Psalm 1 to 41, the second from 42 to 72, the third from 73 to 89, the fourth from 90 to 106, and the final from 107 to 150. And again, the exact nature of these collections is a matter of some debate, but we can make at least 2 good, strong observations about them. First, the Psalter moves from a greater concentration of lament psalms in the earlier group to a higher concentration of praise and thanksgiving psalms in the higher numbers, in the latter groups. Second, that 5-fold division of the Psalter is almost assuredly meant to be reflective of the 5-fold division of the Torah, which we should also note is the primary subject of Psalm 1, the first psalm, and Psalm 119, the longest psalm. Now, finally, for this lecture, we would do also well, I think, to consider Brueggemann's proposal that the Psalter can be read with a particular paradigm of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. This reading, I think, has several advantages. First, it requires that we see the Psalter not as a series of unique or atomized poems, but as a collection that really does showcase some theological intentionality. Secondly, and this is what I think is really helpful about this reading, this orientation, disorientation, reorientation is not linear, right? One arrives at the end of a cycle reoriented. So one goes through orientation, disorientation, and finally reorientation, only to find oneself back at the beginning of another cycle. It happens again and again and again. We go back, we go forwards, where we never end, just like as we do in life, right? We meet new situations and we find ourselves constantly in this process of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. So the Psalms as a body then have something to say to us as we go to our life and constantly go through new stages. That's all that we're going to talk about today. Remember that we're going to be looking at Psalm 22 in detail this weekend. If you have not already, please sign up for the component of exegesis that you would like to do. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please do get in touch with me. I look forward to seeing you all on Saturday.